All right, we're going to do chapter 14. The title of the chapter is somewhat interesting, Training for Sport, and that implies that there might be something different when you train for sport compared to when you train for just health and wellness or strength and conditioning or cardiovascular fitness or whatever. So there could be nuances to this chapter that may not necessarily be um, consistent with what you would tell the general population. The chapter overview starts on slide number 2, and it discusses the various topics that the chapter will go over. Number 1, optimizing training. It will put together a training model, and I've given my students a periodization chart that I use with my gymnasts so they have a deeper understanding, but we'll get into some of the aspects of periodization. And the chapter does talk a lot about overtraining, overreaching, and overtraining syndrome, and what happens if you don't have a periodization and a variation of your exercises and training types and training modes. And it also talks about tapering and detraining towards the end of the chapter. In order for your muscles and your cardiovascular system to adapt, either by growing more tissues or increasing capillarization or mitochondrial growth, there needs to be stresses. And doing strength and conditioning adds a physical stress to your muscles and causes micro damage to the Z discs, and as a result, there's adaptation. But there's other stresses that occur as well, like lack of sleep and nutritional stresses and psychological stresses, like at the gym doing things that you're afraid of, or emotional stresses, getting forced to do things by your coach without necessary compassion and things like that. So there's lots of stress in a training environment, and those stresses need to be managed and understood and thought about. But in any event, like in even in life, stress causes strain, and the strain in terms of physiological adaptation results in muscle hypertrophy and transitioning of muscle fiber types and increase in muscle oxidative enzymes that allow for oxygen to break down carbohydrate. And so a lot of the adaptations occur within 6 to 10 weeks of initial training, and it depends on the volume, intensity, frequency, duration. It depends on the type of exercise that you're doing. It depends on the nutritional status and the training status of the athlete that you're working with. Um, the rate of muscle adaptation and improvement is dependent highly on genetics. There are many differences between athletes in regards to muscle fiber type and cardiovascular functioning and the length of limbs and the leverage that they have, and because of that, there has to be a differentiated approach to strength training, and also every sport requires different strengths and different efficiencies. So because of that, there has to be a very global and at the same time also very individualized strategy to putting together sport and training programs and things. Rest is very important when you're actually lifting and doing the activity. The muscles breaking down, and it's the rest that actually allows your muscles to heal and to increase in size and protein synthesis. So you need to make sure that you have a balance between volume and intensity. And usually, if the volume goes up, the intensity should drop, and likewise. And if you're not aware of those relationships, then it could be the case that your athlete begins to train too much. Uh, we won't get into the word overtraining yet, but too much training or excessive training or overreaching can eventually result in performance decrements. And the epitome of training too much is called overtraining, and that becomes a chronic problem where the athlete could become fatigued, or even it negatively impacts the immune system. So you could introduce illness and all sorts of things. Um, right now, we're on slide 5. In order to increase anything in terms of muscle physiology and cardiovascular physiology, you must follow the term progressive overload, which means the stress or the stimulus on the body needs to increase past normal values if you want the body to continually respond to those and to adapt. So that progressive increase in either volume or intensity or even duration of slow glycolytic endurance will catalyze improvements in the muscle and the hormones and the oxidative enzymes and the neural patterning that goes synchronizes the muscles. And also training will improve in terms of technique and efficiency of the motion and things. So got to make sure that you're adding stresses, but at the same time, if those stresses aren't balanced by rest and nutrition and hydration, then there could be negative impacts on sport performance. Undertraining, which means that there's insufficient amount of intensity and volume to maintain um, the strength, power, and hypertrophy that you've gained through your initial training. If you undertrain, then those particular gains will eventually subside and there'll be a reduction in sport performance. Additionally, overtraining is associated with loss of strength, power, and potential injuries. So we want to find just the right amount for each person to train, and that could be dependent upon the sport, dependent upon the season, depending upon training status. So there could be a number of different things. Typically, in the normal year, you're going to have bouts of training hard and bouts of rest, and that's normal in a periodization chart. Um, for the gymnasts that I coach, we have an active rest which lasts 5 weeks, and that's right after the championship meet, the national championship. And then we get into an off season that we focus on hypertrophy, and a preseason that we focus on strength and power. And then during the season, we have um, half of the in season broken up where we do muscle maintenance and muscle endurance. So during the off season, there is a good amount of undertraining, but it's active rest. We want to make sure that our athletes are continuing to improve in terms of flexibility, range of motion. We do a lot of fast glycolysis, aerobic training, but there has to be some time where rest or during the off season. So technically, they're under training. There has to be also some increase in stressors during the season, which could lead to overreaching. But overreaching with a resultant rest period will result in the muscles becoming micro damaged and sore, and there'll be an initial reduction in reduction in like sport performance associated with protein synthesis and things. The muscle's got to break down, so the decrement is going to be there, but then there's going to be a benefit in muscle synthesis and growth and hypertrophy and things afterwards. So overreaching is somewhat necessary for those training adaptations to occur. It's part of that progressive overload. But if overreaching becomes overtraining, then you have a greater issue. And it's not the case that like with overreaching, if you rest and you allow the body to heal and to for nutrition and things like that, then those symptoms can somewhat reasonably be reversed. But with overtraining, it could become a chronic syndrome where rest and a couple of days off isn't going to do the trick. It could the results of overtraining syndrome could, or the symptoms of overtraining syndrome could subside for months to extended period of time. So we want to avoid overtraining. Figure 14.1 is a schematic that shows the the not necessarily linear path between undertraining, acute overload, overreaching. Could be the case that some athletes reach overtraining prior to others. Excessive training is somewhere in between acute overload and overreaching, according to the chapter. So I'll let you guys take a look at that table. Overreaching is systematic. What systematic means is it's planned. That's what exercise is. Exercise is planned or systematic, structured physical activity designed to improve wellness. Overreaching is when you plan the overload. And what you do is you improve, or sorry, not improve, you increase the stimulus by either increasing the volume or the intensity of what you're lifting, or the duration or the time. And then what that does is it allows the body to adapt to the stimulus. If you increase the stimulus past a particular amount, the body thinks that it might get injured. So the body's going to try to adapt to that, just like finches would. So what the body tries to do is respond to the stresses that are on it, and make the body better able to handle the stresses. Now, usually with resistance training, the stresses are going to be more physical in nature, so the body's going to try to improve musculature, hypertrophy. And then if the intensity isn't high enough, so if you're doing resistance training and the intensity is high enough, then testosterone will get released, and then you'll have protein synthesis and RNA restructuring at the cell, the nuclear level in the muscle fiber, and then so the adaptations will be to increase muscle strength. But if the intensity of the training isn't high enough, like if the weight isn't high enough that you're lifting, or if you're doing endurance training, then the adaptation is going to be such that the body is going to be more likely to improve its ability to utilize carbohydrate, fat, protein, and oxygen to create ATP. So there's going to be increase in mitochondrial density and oxidative enzymes and capillarization and cardiovascular fitness and things like that. So the overstressing the body is going to result in all sorts of adaptations, including neural adaptations and hormonal adaptations. So, but there needs to be nutrition and rest, and there needs to be a balance between appropriate stresses and appropriate de-stressing. So, I mean, things like meditation and diaphragmatic breathing, and even just like every once in a while, like maybe we just don't do strength and conditioning one night and we just calm down, and maybe we just give the guys a break and save precious calories. So we do not want the volume and the intensity to become an extreme. And just because they can do 10 push-ups doesn't mean they should do 20 and 30 and 40 and 50. And sometimes the guys want to weight everything, and they're doing depth jumps and depth drops and box jumps, and they want to weight everything. And it's just, sometimes you don't need to increase intensity. Sometimes you can increase velocity and not increase the intensity, so that you can improve strength and power and things like that. So or sometimes, if you have homeschooled athletes, it could be the case that they can do a 3-hour practice in the morning, and then they can also come in and do a 3-hour practice in the evening. But is that necessarily good for the health and wellness of the athlete? I mean, that's all going to be individually based, so I don't want to make any claims. But more is not necessarily better after a certain point, all right? In regards to research, there have been swimming studies that athletes trained 3 to 4 hours per day and then reduced to 1 to 1.5 hours per day, and it didn't seem like there was any reduction in strength or performance, but there was, in terms of long-term swimming, but there was potentially a reduction in strength and sprint performance. So, but more is not necessarily better. So there was another swim study that did, I believe, single versus multiple daily training sessions. They had athletes train for 20 weeks, and The 5th to 10th week, they had one group was split into double training while the other group stayed single training. And then they looked at their blood lactate levels and their heart rate and didn't see any improvements or any changes in improvement from either one of the groups. So 1 or 2 times per day seemed to be an equal efficiency in regards to training for those swimmers. That's on slide 11. Also, slide 12, where it shows exercise heart rate. Um, in regards to what amount of volume each exercise or each sport or each training session should be, it's going to be dependent on the periodization structure, what time of season you're at, what sport you're talking about, the athlete, the training level of the athlete, how much nutrition the athlete can get in. So it could be the case that less training reduces risk. Gymnastics is very, very physical, and the more you're training difficult skills, the more potential risk there is for training difficult skills. The heavier and the more involved the weight and the strength training program that you have in regards to changing from weight vests and ankle weights to actual kettlebells and dumbbells, then all of a sudden there's an increased risk. Um, so it could be the case that reducing volume actually reduces risk as well. And this could also be the case for sprint type performances and things like that, which imply greater forces throughout the body compared to something like long term, low intensity rowing. There should be an inverse relationship between intensity and volume. So as we move into the strength and power um, phases of our off-season training, especially with the younger athletes, we want to make sure that if we are increasing the volume, that we allow for them to rest and take into account their emotional, psychological, nutritional, and neurological health and things like that. So we want to make sure that if we are introducing plyometrics at a particular time during the off season, that we also introduce something like yoga or meditation or some other stress reducing counter to the increase in stress that we have. So there should be a reduction in volume if intensity increases. Chapter Slide 15 starts to talk about periodization, and I have given my athletes a periodization chart that they can see how the specific off-season, preseason, in-season, and post-season goals change from hypertrophy, strength and power, to muscle maintenance and muscle endurance. I have a single year macro cycle that's broken down into 6-week mesocycles, and there are 2-week microcycles. And we also have individual weekly training plans that we also do. So there's a hierarchical structure of the training program, and oftentimes the book suggests that there could be even a higher macro cycle than the 1 year training plan, especially in gymnastics, because we're focused on the Olympic training cycle. So there's a 4 year even bigger macro cycle if you're an Olympic sport potentially. There's many different types of periodizations, but it's going to be dependent upon the sport and how many championship seasons. And in gymnastics, they may want to make a change where they move one championship season to the middle of the summer as opposed to keep it at the end of the year. And what that would mean is that we'd have to really adjust our periodization plans to a 2 peak per year training plan, and that would significantly change a lot of things. So there's some debate whether or not to keep it as it is to make sure that the periodization plans aren't adjusted so radically. Overtraining is really difficult to necessarily diagnose. It's not going to necessarily be easy to determine who is overtrained, and there's no necessarily remedy for overtraining by short-term rest. So, I mean, it could be because of psychological causes, neurological issues. It could be nutritional. It could be muscle breakdown. It could be a number of causes, but there's a severe or serious reduction in performance and function, and that can last for up to weeks or months or years. So we do not want to allow our athletes to become overtrained. So one of the things that we do is we take a lot of variables. We do heart rate, blood pressure. I do height and weight. I also ask, certain things about sleep and their mood and things like that. And it's all to just try to collect information. And if I notice that athletes are having problems with their sleep and their heart rate is going up, then maybe there is an issue with overtraining that we can predict, because our guys do a lot, and it's hard for us to manage their nutrition. So one of the things is I look for an increased resting heart rate, because our athletes are really specifically involved with resistance training, and because of that, the sympathetic nervous system could be impacted, and if that's the case, it would lead to increased blood pressure, increased resting heart rate, and things like that. So I typically take resting heart rate, weight, height. If their weight starts dropping and they're using fat-free mass or something like that, or they're not able to put on weight during hypertrophy season, stuff like that, maybe I'm thinking that they need a little bit more rest. So symptoms of overtraining symptoms are not really consistent to everybody. They're individualized, and it could include reductions in strength, fatigue, change in appetite, sleep and mood, lack of motivation, depression. So sometimes the athletes will be doing skills, during one month that they don't seem to be timid of, and then the next month they really seem kind of startled that we're asking them to do the moves. Or it seems like in the end of practice they seem a little bit tired sometimes, or they complain that their muscles are fatigued all the time. Those are things that I really have to pay attention to, make sure that they're getting, proper carbohydrates and proper rest and nutrition. And so sometimes when the athletes start to talk about that, then I'll intentionally like get to strength and conditioning later, or maybe not even do it and focus on foam rolling, or in the gym, instead of spotting skills, I do a lot of deep tissue massage and things like that. So keep like qualitatively asking questions about those symptoms. Overtraining can be related to intensity and volume, increase in other stressors, emotional stressors, and all the stress just keeps piling on the athletes. So as a coach, it's not just, physical wellness that I'm interested in. I'm looking at emotional wellness, social wellness, whether or not they have nutritional wellness, and listen to what they talk about. And I try not to have them do skills that they're afraid of, because that adds to the stress, and they're already under huge nutritional demands and the pounding of their feet into the floor. And then the physiological factors can also come into play, like changes in hormones. With overtraining, cortisol increases and testosterone decreases with overtraining. Cortisol is a catabolic hormone, and testosterone is an anabolic hormone, so there's going to be a reduction in protein synthesis with that. There's also a reduction in immune efficiency, so athletes are going to be more likely to get sick. So I try to look for things like chapped lips, any styes or anything like that, or any cold sores, or like a different pallor. Or so I just try to observe my athletes. Slide number 19 shows sport performance, and um, there's a difference between the left and right, in the sense that the left chart shows acute overload and overreaching, where there is a decrement and a rise, and a decrement and a rise in the performance, but the rise or the increase in performance is out outdueling the reduction in sport performance, so that there's an overall increase. But with overtraining, you can see that the decrement in sport performance between bouts of exercise is overpowering the increase in performance because of rest and nutrition, and there's an overall reduction in, or a decrement in, the sport performance. So definitely do not want to allow our athletes into this overtraining um, uh, characteristic or situation. So if my athletes are doing resistance training, typically there are going to be sympathetic nervous system changes. If they're doing endurance training, there'll be more parasympathetic nervous system changes. So I'm going to be typically looking for an increase in blood pressure, loss of appetite, weight loss, sleep and emotional disturbances, increased basal metabolic rate for my athletes. I have my athletes do the health-calc.com website, and they find what their basal metabolic rate is using the total energy expenditure chart, and I keep track of their basal metabolic rate. If I see changes in that, or if I see rapid, like not rapid weight, but if I notice weight loss or lack of ability to increase weight during strength and power hypertrophy phases, or I ask them about their appetite. If I see changes like that, I'm thinking maybe this is a cue that their sympathetic nervous system is responding to an overtraining stimulus. If they're doing endurance training, it would be an opposite. It would be it would be a parasympathetic nervous system um, an issue potentially, and that would lead to things like early fatigue during their bout of training, decreased resting heart rate, decreased resting blood pressure, and other things. So for my athletes, I'm going to just take a look at resting heart rate. If I notice there's an increase in resting heart rate, an increase in basal metabolic rate, and a reduction in overall body weight, then to me, I think that we have some hypothesis to suggest that our guys need a little bit more rest. With overtraining, there's also going to be inefficient endocrine responses. Like there's going to be a reduction in thyroxine and testosterone, which build up muscle, and there's going to be an increase in cortisol, which breaks down muscle. That's going to lead to potential lack of muscle mass, which is going to lead to lack of strength and power, and that's not a good thing. So we want to make sure that we make sure our hormonal balance is also maintained. Slide 23 shows a graph that um, is a pictorial representation of the reduction in testosterone and thyroxine with increases in cortisol, with increased training and number of training days. So you can see that that's a relationship that will result in eventual protein loss, and that's not necessarily what we want. It's difficult, however, to tell whether or not somebody is actually overtrained. One way that you could do it is by looking at an increase in blood urea concentration, and that's going to be an indicator that more protein is being utilized by fuel. And yep, you're getting that protein from your muscles, and that's because you're potentially not nourished, or because you're just your body just needs energy from somewhere. So there's an increase in resting catecholamines, and overreaching may be also potentially determined via heart rate increases. So it's difficult to tell whether or not somebody is actually overtraining, but I try to do the best I can and observe my athletes. There are also other neurological factors that can lead to, or that will result in overtraining syndrome. We talked about a change to the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, but it can also affect the signals that are coming from the hypothalamus, and which can lead to all sorts of other hormonal changes. So it's a multi-system potential problem in regards to overtraining. There are potential immune system responses. There are as the trauma to the muscles and the joints increase, there's a rush of white blood cells and such to the area, which is going to increase inflammation, which is going to increase cytokines, and that could act on other tissues in the body, and potentially result in tissue degradation. Slide 28, there could be reduction in immune functioning because of a reduction in lymphocytes, and therefore a reduction in antibodies, and it could be the case that there are immuno complications. Figure 14.7 shows a J-shaped or a U-shaped relationship between, and an inverse relationship between immune function and disease susceptibility, such that with overtrained or exhaustive exercise, the immune function drops, and with the and at the same vein, the disease susceptibility increases. But with regular to moderate exercise, there's a peak in immune function and a trough or a minimum value in regards to disease susceptibility. So it's with regular moderate exercise that it seems that is best in terms of immune health. Predicting overtraining system, we said, is difficult. It's going to be different for each athlete. So we just try to make sure that I try to make sure in our gym that I just observe. I look for things. I ask questions about sleep patterns and nutrition. I talk about things like emotions and try to be compassionate to my athletes and try to allow for them to rest and save the cache of calories and reduce stress where I can. So, but it's very difficult. I'm trying right now to take a look at basal metabolic rate. I have a bioelectrical impedance scale that we take a look at body composition and body weight. I take a look at heart rate as well, and I also try to visually inspect for signs that might indicate a reduction in immune functioning and things. It is the case that if you look at figure 14.8, there's an overtrained OT group, which is in yellow, and there's a regular trained group, which is T in blue. And for the overtrained group, there's an increase in heart rate. So that's my justification for taking a resting heart rate for my athletes. And we could also take heart rate during activity. But for us, I just have them sit down for a minute or two and take their resting heart rate. And I mean, it's as quick as I can do it, but maybe it'll give us some data. Treatment for overtraining syndrome is to reduce intensity of the training, and you may have to do so for weeks to months because they're overtrained, not overreached. If they were overreached, you could rest for an appropriate amount of time and build rest into the periodization chart that you have and the strategy that you have. But with overtraining syndrome, it could be something more than that. It could be the case that there's emotional stress that needs to be dealt with, and if that's the case, it could be sport counseling or sports psychologist or something like that in order to deal with emotional stresses. So, in order to prevent, we want to make sure that we're periodization. We make sure that they have plenty of calorie intake and plenty of rest. And also, I want to educate my athletes. I don't want to just tell them to rest. I don't want to just tell them to eat. I want to help them. I want to help them understand. And as they get older, someday they'll be able to think for themselves and say, well, I'm not going to eat because I'm told to eat. I'm going to eat because this is healthy for my body and will help the performance of my gymnastics or my sport. So I just want to make sure they have education no matter how old they are. And tapering, slide 33, is another example of how a reduction in training could actually result in an increase in performance. So tapering is when there's a reduction in training, both in either volume or intensity. It could be 4 to 28 days prior to a major competition, and then the result is increased muscular strength, and the body is able to repair itself prior to the competition, and you can reserve muscle glycogens that are spent during training. So it could be the case that it's better for some training cycles, some sports that are and less efficient for others. But it seems as though where you have sports where there's infrequent competitions, such as gymnastics or even track or something like that, it seems to be useful. It does not necessarily result in muscle atrophy or deconditioning, especially if it's done with highly trained athletes. It could be the case that you could reduce training by 60% and not have reductions in VO2 max. So it also leads to potential improved race time by 3% and other unknown effects on sports like gymnastics and all sorts of other things. And team sports are really hard to predict because there's other people on the team who may have tapered and may not have tapered, but it seems to be associated with potential 18 to 25% improvement in arm strength and power. So tapering is just an example in this chapter of how a reduction in training actually is good for training. So I think that maybe what we do is we implement a little bit of tapering in our performance, in our strength and conditioning in gymnastics, and try to reduce stresses. Detraining, however, is potentially a bigger issue. Tapering is when you detrain for a short period of time, and detraining is when it's a longer period of time, such as on slide 37, if you're in a cast and you're immobilized, or if you're during the off season or whatever. And then if that's the case, there would be a 5 week cessation of training. If that's the case, immobilization is going to lead to atrophy very, very quickly. It's going to lead to an ineffective neuromuscular synchronization. So there's going to be a reduction in the efficiency of muscle fiber recruitment. And there's also going to be a reduction in oxidative enzymes, which could alter the synthesis of the macronutrients at a metabolic level. Um, there is a reduction in muscle endurance relatively quickly, seen just about after 2 weeks, and that could be due to a reduction in oxidative enzymes. And if that's the case, there's a inefficiency in pulling oxygen from the blood, bringing the oxygen to the mitochondria, and using the oxygen and carbohydrate and other macronutrients to produce ATP for fuel. Figure 14.9 shows a reduction in various oxidative enzymes due to detraining, and it could be the case that it is the reduction in these oxidative enzymes, specifically cytochrome oxidase, that is an indicator of the initial reductions in VO2 max. Detraining is also going to reduce muscle glycogen stores, and it could be the case that the reduction exceeds 40% in some instances. It could also result in significant issues with the acidic nature of the blood after blood lactate. After lactic acid is generated, and that could lead to shifts or inefficiencies in blood lactate accumulation, and the lactate threshold could shift. There could also be a reduction in the pH even further, which is going to lead to potential breakdown of cellular integrity and membranes and things like that. So, slide 41, figure 14.10 shows the reduction in muscle glycogen, and it compares an untrained group of athletes with a group of swimmers, and it shows that although both groups are detrained for a number of weeks, the swimmers have a more significant reduction in muscle glycogen. So it could be that trained athletes have more of an effect size to detraining than untrained athletes would. Detraining, all right, where are we? On slide 44, there are also significant cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory losses. There could be an increase in submax. Slide 44 shows that with detraining, there are also cardiorespiratory losses. In a bed rest study, there were significant increases in submaximal heart rate. Those submaximal heart rate increases were most likely due to reduction in stroke volume, and the reduction in stroke volume was probably most likely due to a reduction in blood plasma volume, which is going to result in an overall reduction in maximal cardiac output. So there is somewhat of an effect on the cardiorespiratory and the neuromuscular system with detraining. It also appears as though that trained athletes lose VO2 max and have a harder time increasing their VO2 max after detraining. Slide 45, figure 14.11 is a demonstration of this. You'll notice that the athletes in the bottom in the red, yellow, and green are all not trained, and the athletes at the top are all trained. There is a more significant reduction in VO2 max during bed rest with the blue and purple graphs, and the slope of the blue and purple graphs is much less compared to the bottom graphs in regards to their VO2 max response to exercise training. So it is an indicator that trained athletes have a greater effect size due to detraining than untrained athletes. The rest of the chapter talks about detraining in space with microgravity and how that affects muscle mass and cardiac output, it appears as though that there's, because of deep training, there's an increase in stroke volume. I'd have to take a look more into that. Hope that you guys can too, but I'm good with this chapter right now.